Om. 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 Om Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Om Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Om Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Greetings to all of you. As we started our study of this textbook, Buddhist Thought in India, by Edward Conze, and went through the preface and first chapter of the first part, titled Archaic Buddhism, and the chapter being Tacit Assumptions, meaning implicit assumptions, or assumptions based on the prior context. So primarily the author observed 6 important points, and of course during the chapter 1 he elaborated on those. For those of you who might be seeing this as a very text-oriented or textual-oriented, I would assure you this is probably the best method of taking a deep dive into the system. What happens is the teaching in the monasteries does not have an analysis or a component of systematization. Very, very often they would take a textbook and go through that by teaching some principles, and they do not question many times the contents of it. Of course, they would be argumenting that by what is called practice. Whereas in an academic situation, people are less interested in being driven to practice because they do not want to bias themselves to a kind of what they call brainwashing, you see. They want to be open-minded. They want to take the contents in a logical, systematic fashion, and then arrive at conclusions in the so-called scientific method. Nothing wrong with it. But of course, they lack the wisdom that would come owing to practice. So, having spent quite a lot of time in this line of spiritual inquiry, I personally felt that it is essential to combine both. Even if you go to the monasteries, especially I know even the Vedantic ashramas where they are teaching, they would take the Shankara Bhashya, or the commentary written by Acharya Shankara on the triple canon, that is the Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, and Brahma Sutra, and go line by line. Because probably it is not practical and easy for any teacher to give all the nuances that were discussed by Acharya Shankara in the same fashion to the students, if the teacher does not take recourse to the commentary line by line. So although it may look a bit tedious that the teacher has to read every word and every sentence and try to explain the meaning to the students, there is no better way. Because if you lose some continuity of thought of Acharya Shankara, it is very difficult to get to the conclusions that he does. Similarly, even in the Buddha Dharma, when you are studying these complex texts, as I mentioned in the preface and the first chapter, etc., about the various texts that are used by the people who are studious and are working towards learning the contents of the Buddha Dharma and bring it into their practice, they have to resort to these various textbooks that are available. And by a competent teacher, one must understand every concept, every principle, every precaution given for sadhana. Also, in my own case, I personally feel when I study a textbook, I do not find a friend or a teacher who is exactly teaching the same thing, so that I can pinpoint and ask specific doubts I have in the course of that discussion that happens in the textbook. So because of that, there will be many doubts left, and I never find somebody else who is good enough with whom I can discuss and get resolution to some of those problems. But I have to live with it because there is no choice. There is nobody else, at least comes to my view, who is so diligent and is really committed to studying, contemplating, meditating, and arriving at truth. For many people, this spiritual seeking is just a time pass. It's just a time pass. They are really not asking questions sincerely, saying, what is it that I am seeking? What are the tools available to me? What is the literature available to me? Who can help me understand this literature and bring about the transformation of consciousness? They are not diligently working at it. At least I do not come across many people who do that. So because of that, this is really a lonely path even after these millennia. That is when some of these great authors come to our aid, because they themselves have struggled for decades going through what is available, contemplating, and arriving at some system. So we want to take advantage of that as sincere students, so that we gain from their struggles, we gain from their wisdom, and we don't get stuck in the initial stages, but we move along and quickly progress. So I urge any of my listeners to sincerely pick up these books. I picked up this book thinking that this will give one of the best introductions, not just for Buddhism, but how about religious thought itself. So even though the book is titled Buddhist Thought in India, for me it is no different from any religious thought in India or spiritual thought in India, etc. Because ultimately, human problem is the same. Each religion may be one proposition of a solution. So these things that we discussed so far are equally applicable and relevant for a Hindu seeker as well. That is why I took it, though I myself spent at least 2+ decades in studying various Hindu literature of Prasthanatrayi. Now I find a lot of benefit in the last maybe 4 or 5 years of time, when I've been devoting a lot of time towards studying Buddhism systematically. And I really don't find any difference between the two so far, even though some people cry foul about it. But I am totally in agreement with the compatibility of the two religious propositions and pointing to the same. And one works as a complement to the other to bring about the required transformation. I have no hesitation in saying I feel myself at ease with what I am, where I am going, about my own struggles. So I want to encourage anybody, if possible, to take up the same study, take up this textbook and study, or listen to me as I am reading, though you might have difficulty with my English or with following my quick reading, because I myself come under pressure, sometimes thinking maybe I am taking too much time. But for those people who are okay to reset their study, this is certainly a useful starting point. Then you can build on. A course curriculum is needed. For example, one of the great things, observations that I made when I was referring to Chinmaya mission as well, almost 2 decades ago, more than 2 decades ago, that there is a syllabus given and they follow that. Of course, the same thing happens, even though not published that way, if you go to Kailash Ashram in India, or Sadhana Southern in Rishikesh, or a couple of other places in India. There it is much more clear, because Prasthana 3 are the threefold path, three roads of Gita, Upanishads and Brahma Sutra. You take the commentaries and read one by one, but of course there is a host of preliminary prakarana or beginning chapter-wise books available on the various topics that people go through. So over a period of time, over 3 to 12 years, people spend between 3 to 12 years on this path. Swami Vivekananda and Swami Brahmananda of Ramakrishna Mission, they are very old. They also said it should take about 3 years' time to bring about the calmness of the mind and bring about transformation. And many other saints have said that. And in the Buddhism, they really spend their time out. At least if we read the old literature, that's what we find. They are dedicated for their sadhana. But we don't find too many people like that, unfortunately, in the marketplace today, who say, I am committed for this. Even a monk of either a Hindu or probably even a Buddhist tradition is preoccupied with many other things than study and contemplation. Many of them are struggling to build ashrams, build a name, fame, earn money, a fancy, and nowadays this Facebook, etc. has crowded some people's mind, so they are always interested in posting photos, sharing photos, more than contemplation and resolving doubts, and come to a Nischayatmika buddhi, a determination in the mind as to what is the human situation, life. So I strongly urge. To that extent, if any of you can take up, for example, university degrees in comparative religion, either focused on Hinduism or Buddhism or any other religion of your thought, it is never a waste. It is never a waste. In fact, there will be pressure for people to study, so which means you will always be active, brain will be active. And this realization is not for dullards. This is said in plenty of times in the Upanishads as well as in the Buddha Vachana as well. You must be diligent, study, contemplate, meditate, inquire. And these are not for dullards. These are for very diligent, hardworking people. Dhiraha, they say, dhiraha in Sanskrit, who struggle against odds, who do not lose their focus. They are dhiras, are the courageous beings, courageous people. So please take up MA in religion or MA in comparative religion and work on it, because then you will not lose touch with it. In India, of course, in the Hindu community, I see this apathy towards study. Even those who go to college, BA, MA, MS, they just give up all study after college degree is obtained, and they live their life the remaining 50, 60, 70 years with no study, just doing some transactional worldly matters and fighting and accumulating and somehow living this life until they are dead, like a sheep which does not have intelligence to escape but is just waiting for slaughter. So if any of you have sense and seriousness that this effort also should not go futile. Many things in life have gone futile. Why should this spiritual seeking also go futile? Why not we focus on getting a desired result before the body falls? So you need to study. That is the intention I took this book, so that at least an overall picture is gained by people. Of course, to me, my benefit is always in this. That's how I started. Of course, I read through, but for your benefit, I'm reading so that I can also add one or two sentences, and you may find benefit and motivated to study. Of course, as I read through the chapter 1, there were a few Latin phrases that were often used. Since I am not conversant with any of those languages, or for that matter, even the Western philosophy, I am never educated. So I have some difficulty, but I still carry on, and I seeing some similarities to the extent I can understand. But as long as we continue with taking help from the wisdom of Edward Conze, of course I also hear some people pronouncing it as Edward Conze. Of course, because I am not familiar with the German name either pronunciation, so probably people may be pronouncing both ways, Edward Conze or Edward Conze. So much about my request to you people to be focused on study, contemplation, reflection, meditation. These are all required fields. And as if you can be patient with me, you would find that Edward Conze also very diligently brings out each point that we need to know. At least he is going to present to us all the terminology and concepts that need to be brought to our attention. And as you understand them to the extent available in this text, then you can take other detailed textbooks wherever your interest takes you, but build an entire system within our mind. Go through the entire cycle. They say there's enchilada, which is the complete course. Has to be gone through. So even that effort will be very richly rewarded. One will come to a settlement. Oh, okay, here is this complete solution. So then you start living with it, and slowly transformation comes. And that's my personal feeling and my faith in that. So you may benefit from these few words. Now we move on to the chapter 2, which is the problem of original Buddhism. What is interesting to note is the Buddhist literature, as we refer to as Tripitaka, possibly is the earliest available literature, at least of Indian religions. Though we may see some literature from Lao Tzu, Ch2 in the Chinese context, maybe they are in the similar contemporary range of written literature. Even the Hindu literature, such as the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Puranas, they have been written only after the Christian era. Before that, they were oral. So obviously there are many interpolations. The Tripitaka, especially the one which is available in fragments in India in Sanskrit, or the Pali canon, that is the earliest available literature that we have in written formats. And so that becomes the source of even knowing the society of that time. So maybe we can definitely learn greatly from that. The Upanishads, the Veda, though they are much older, they have always remained an oral tradition. So for those who want written records, Buddhist literature happens to be the earliest available to us now. So some of you who want to really know about these things should start somewhere there. For any topic, we have to go there and start. Maybe the Jaina literature that came later than that. And of course the modern literature, all that. Some of the Greek philosophy as contemporary to Buddha. Aristotle and so on. So please, all of them, but in terms of the best available literature is the Tripitaka and some of the other literature. Even the Sanskrit literature is all after the Christian era, whereas Tripitaka precedes that. So this is the benefit of that. You know, with this background, obviously the question that comes up is this a dependable thing? So the author discusses here the problem of original Buddhism. Means what is original? That is the question. Now, a history of Buddhist thought might be expected to begin with an account of the teachings of the Buddha himself, or at least of the beliefs current in the most ancient community. The nature of our literary documents makes such an attempt fruitless and impossible. The documents, as we have them, date back to no farther than the Christian era. That is to say, they were fixed 500 years after the Buddha's life on earth. Assuming that Buddha's birth is to have taken place about 560 to 480 BC. 560 to 480 BC, assuming that is the time range of Buddha's birth. So at least 500 years after that only, the earliest literature of Buddhism is available to us. Written literature. Some of their contents must surely be quite early. Means whatever is available to us, it must have contained some prior teachings, while others are certainly fairly late. So there are inclusions of that newer era, that is, whatever was being taught after 500 years after Buddha passed away. So the content what is available to us now is not strictly what is taught by the Buddha. At least that's what we surmise. In order to single out the earlier layers, we must compare the recensions of the different schools, principally the Pali canon of the Theravadins, the Sanskrit scriptures of the Sarvastivadins, and the few surviving texts of the Mahasanghikas. So we will come to know more about these terms, Theravadins, Sarvastivadins, and Mahasanghikas, as we read through the text. These were the early sects that were available almost 300 years later, after Buddha. Okay, we'll come to that. Where we find passages in which the texts of Theravadins and Sarvastivadins agree, almost word by word, we can assume that they were composed at a time antedating the separation of the two schools, which took place during the Asoka's rule, roughly about 250 BC. Roughly about 250 BC, during the time of Asoka, these schools separated. So if these two schools have textbooks where the content is verbatim matching, so we can say the content came from time before these schools itself. Where they do not agree, we may, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, infer their post-Asokan date, means after 250 BC, whereas Buddha himself was, as we said, 560 to 480 BC. In those cases where we can establish a close similarity also with the Mahasanghika texts, we are carried back one more century to 340 BC. Means Mahasanghikas preceded them. So if these contents match even with the Mahasanghikas, you go back another century to 340 BC. Within 140 years of the Buddha's nirvana, when the Mahasanghikas separated from the Sthaviras, who were the ancestors of both Theravadins and Sarvastivadins. So the two groups, Sarvastivadins and Theravadins, were branched out from the group known as Sthaviras. So the Mahasanghikas separated from the Sthaviras. So Sthaviras being so the Mahasangha 340 BC, within 140 years of Buddha's nirvana, when the Mahasanghika separated from the Sthaviras, who were the ancestors of both Theravadins and Sarvastivadins. This can be done with some of the Vinaya texts. Vinaya texts are those which talk about the discipline for the monks. Majority, 99% of the time, they were the instructions for the monks. Because originally when Buddha started, of course, he did not start by writing the discipline for the monks. As the days passed by, he lived through and the problems came, he started putting more and more rules. And later on, they became systematized texts of Vinaya. Vinaya, discipline. This can be done with some of the Vinaya texts. Means you can date them more precisely with the Vinaya texts. The material for a history of Buddhist thought must, however, come not from Vinaya, but from the sutras. The history, if you want to reconstruct Buddhist history, it is not the Vinaya, but the sutras. Sutras mean the spoken words of the Buddha. And their Mahasanghika version is unfortunately lost. The sutras followed by the Mahasanghikas is lost. That's a very unfortunate thing. So the situation is rather unsatisfactory, and we should constantly remain aware of the limitations of our knowledge. Because Mahasanghikas separated 140 years after the Buddha's nirvana, and we don't have the sutras written by them. So we have to depend on the Theravadins, which came much later. So this is a limitation, primary limitation. We can now define more precisely what is meant by the Archaic Buddhism, to which the first part of this book is devoted. It is not the original doctrine of the Buddha, which is the fountainhead of all later thought. It is not the original doctrine of the Buddha, which is the fountainhead of all later thought, but which, like most catalysts, cannot be isolated and described as it was by itself. So we cannot isolate. So based on the original Buddha's teaching, the later developments came. Like a catalyst cannot be isolated and described as it was by itself. So the catalyst works in the presence of other chemicals, right? Other material, not separately. So you cannot isolate them and separate, but original Buddha's teaching is embedded into the later teachings. That's what it means. It precedes the scholastic Buddhism of the Abhidharma period. It precedes the scholastic Buddhism of the Abhidharma period. Abhidharma period is a systematized categorization of dharmas and the study of them. Okay, all this will come in the following chapters, and is laid down mainly in the sutras. So the scholastic Buddhism of the Abhidharma period obviously came later. So the original Buddhism precedes this Abhidharma period. And obviously that is mainly laid down in the sutras. It is a dogmatic doctrine in that it has for its backbone a great number of numerical lists, which were in all probability later elaborations of the Buddha's teaching. It precedes the scholastic Buddhism of the Abhidharma period and is laid down mainly in the sutras. It is a dogmatic doctrine in that it has for its backbone a great number of numerical lists, which were in all probability later elaborations of the Buddha's teaching, okay, as it is described in the Abhidharma. So we will continue. This is a very required understanding so that we do not get carried away with any doubts that may arise later. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.